Hello and welcome. My name is John Reese, and this is a series that is going to be entitled Your 708 Today. I'm a member of the Channel 17 production crew here and a retired faculty member from Waubonsee Community College, as well as a member of the 708 Inc. Board. Our series is going to take a look at local human services agencies and the services that they offer. For our first program, I've invited Mr. Jerry Murphy, Executive Director of the 708 Inc. Board, to be our first guest. Welcome, Jerry.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you for inviting me.
Jerry, it's good to have you with us today. Can you tell us a little something about the background of what 708 boards are and how they came into existence?
Sure. A little bit of history. Back in the 1960s, the Illinois legislature passed what's known as the Illinois Community Mental Health Act, and that allowed local units of government, counties, townships, and cities to tax themselves in order to provide three types of services: mental health, developmental disability, and substance use disorder services. Now, these local taxes and local boards are all established by voter referendum, so that the voters have to say, yes, we want to be able to do this in our community. Here in Kane County, there's actually two city-based 708 boards. That would be the City of Geneva and the City of St. Charles. And then we have 7 township-based 708 boards in the southern portion of Kane County. And those 7 townships have formed a community mental health funding alliance called the Inc. Board. And so that way we can do that work on a regional basis, if you will, for southern Kane County. The Inc. Board currently funds about 40 programs with 19 different agencies here in southern Kane County.
Wow, that's a lot of different agencies and programs. Can you, without asking you to, of course, name each one of them, can you give us an idea of the scope of the kind of services that your agencies might offer?
Actually, it's a fairly wide scope. Agencies like the Association for Individual Development, they do a lot of the core services for the DD population here in southern Kane County, but they also provide a lot of the core services for the seriously mentally ill here in southern Kane County. But then we also have very diverse funding for other programs like at Mutual Ground, the domestic violence shelter. We fund domestic violence and sexual assault programming for counseling there, and even Prairie State Legal Services. And they provide legal services for our MI and DD populations when they have housing or entitlement issues.
Can you help me out a little bit? MI and DD?
Oh,
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to use jargon. Okay, MI, we'll refer to mental illness as MI, okay? And DD or IDD would be intellectual disabilities or developmental disabilities.
Excellent. Some of our viewers, Jerry, may not be from the southern King County area or the Geneva St. Charles. Does Kendall County have the equivalent to an Inc. board?
Actually, yes. The Kendall County referendum was done countywide, so they actually have a countywide 708 board. The easiest way to contact them would either be through the Kendall County board or through Kendall County Health and Human Services, which is their health department. Yes. Because there in Kendall County, the health department actually delivers the bulk of the behavioral health services.
Excellent, excellent. Jerry, I'm always interested in people's background. How did you come to find out about 708 and join this organization?
Well, it was interesting because when I moved to the Aurora area in 1982, I was involved in property management. I took care of apartments, basically. And but I did take a part-time job working for the Association for Individual Development at one of their CILAs, or community integrated living arrangements, where DD individuals live semi-independently with supervision, And I had a ball doing that. I had a lot of fun working with that population. And then my predecessor, Dan Hanna, had an opening when his boss retired, and Dan stepped up to be executive director. But he needed somebody who knew about running buildings, because the Inc. Board, in addition to funding services through the 19 agencies, also owns 3 buildings on the President's Mercy campus. And he wanted somebody who knew how to run buildings. And basically we have about $4 million worth of buildings. So that was my entree, starting basically as a business manager for the Inc. Board. And then when Dan retired, I fought off 99 other people for his job and got it.
Okay. Well, the focus of today's program is going to be on a layperson's guide to mental illness. And that's a joint venture between the Inc. Board and the Kane County Behavioral Health Council.
Correct.
Could you tell us a little bit about that council?
Yes, that council is a voluntary collaboration of the mental health providers, the hospitals, and the other interested parties like NAMI, the advocacy agencies, and the health department, all interested in improving the mental health situation of the residents of the entire Kane County.
Mm-hmm. Very good. As we move forward with the presentation, I hope people have some interest in what we're going to be talking about, and some people may want to reach out and make some contact with you. How would they make contact with you or the Kane County or the Kane County Behavioral Health Department?
Well, they're always welcome to call me at our offices at the Inc. Board, and that's 630-892-5456. Or they can also call Alexis over at the health department, and her number is 630-264-7670.
Very good. Thanks, Jerry.
Mm-hmm.
At times, the path to recovery from a mental and substance use disorder may be unclear. At times, the path may be rocky. At times, the path may be wandering. But laying a strong foundation, with the support of others, makes all the difference.
So Jerry, the presentation, the Layperson's Guide to Mental Illness, you give fairly frequently around the county. Mm-hmm. If somebody had an interest in having you come out and give the presentation, how would they go about doing that?
Well, and again, the health department and the Inc. Board are collaborating on this, so they could contact either of us at the numbers that I mentioned before.
Okay, at those numbers that you just gave us. Mm-hmm. That's great. Jerry, the phrase mental illness, I think a lot of people hear that word and they talk about that word, but can you give us, for a layperson, what a good, solid definition of mental illness might be?
I'll do my best. Mental illness is really a biological disorder, and I think that's part that the general public doesn't understand. They think that it's some sort of behavior that people choose to do. They don't understand that the true cause of a person's behavior is a biological disorder that disrupts the way they behave, the way they feel about people, what their moods are, etc. I compare it a lot to any other physical disorder. If you had diabetes, that is an instance of your pancreas as an organ in your body malfunctioning, and as a result, you end up with diabetes. In reality, mental illness is another organ in your body, your brain, that has decided to start malfunctioning. And the only difference between your pancreas and your brain is that your brain really affects how you behave, and that's something that people can see, if you're out in public. So, but they don't always make the connection between that.
Sure, being a physical illness as compared to just something that the person wants to do.
Exactly.
There are a lot of myths and misconceptions about what mental illness is and what it isn't. Can you run through what some of those differences?
Oh yeah, because I've heard most of them. I mean, a lot of people think that mental illness is maybe just a character fault, for somebody. They weren't raised right, or some other reason they've just chosen to behave this way. or they think that maybe it's a lack of education, on somebody's part, or they're just ignorant or something like that, or they just don't have enough willpower. Again, they're not making the connection between a physical ailment, the physical disease, and how that affects your behavior. You wouldn't think twice about telling somebody to get their head screwed on straight if they had cancer, or if they had some other disease. So it's not something that you can overcome with your willpower at all. It really is something that needs other treatment approaches.
It is, and I think that's a really, really important point. When I was teaching, one of the things I would share with my students is think about a time when you were maybe on some medication and you had a reaction to that medication. Could you change that reaction by just saying, stop it? And you can't.
Exactly. And I think medication is a great example, because I had actually a friend who was on some medication for Parkinson's, actually. And unfortunately, it gave him the side effect of having hallucinations. I mean, he would have audio and visual hallucinations as a result of the medication. Well, again, that has to do with your chemistry in your brain. If the chemistry goes bad, then your behavior is going to reflect that.
And he just couldn't say stop it and make it go away.
Exactly. But he went to his doctor and asked him to stop the medication and find something else that worked better.
That was probably a real wise choice.
It was.
Yeah.
Well, he was fortunate enough
Yeah.
to be married to a nurse, so.
That's great. One of my favorite ones is a phrase that I learned many, many years ago when I was in college, was a schizophrenic mother. It was Reichman, a psychiatrist in the 30s. She blamed mental illness on the mother. So it's always fun to blame everything on your mother, but it's important to understand that it's a brain disease.
Oh, it definitely is.
Okay. And like other diseases, cancer or heart disease, when we say the word cancer, there's a whole range of different kinds of cancers. Mm-hmm. There can be, just a little skin cancer, or cancer of the lung or pancreas, or some really devastating types. Is it the same for mental illness?
Oh, definitely. There's the mental illness takes in an entire range of disorders. ADHD is one that a lot of people are familiar with, mm-hmm. especially in children. But then you have the more serious ones, schizophrenia, bipolar, depression, anxiety. At any one point, and I think people don't understand just how common some of these are, because at some point, each of those that I just got done mentioning can affect between 2 and 4% of the population, which means that any one time over the course of a year, almost 20% of the world or the state's population can be affected by some form of mental illness, ranging from fairly mild to being very serious.
How about Illinois? Is Illinois' issue of the frequency of mental illness different than the rest of the nation, higher, lower?
Actually, we pretty much mirror the national numbers for the most part. Mm-hmm.
Do we? With the kinds of issues that folks are having, there's a lot of impact that also goes on in terms of how it affects the economy and the finances of families. Can you tell us a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I bring that up a lot when we talk to different business groups.
Sure.
Because business groups like to talk about dollars. Well, the fact of the matter is that the direct effect of mental illness can amount to almost $70 billion worth of impact. And that has to do with everything from hospitalizations to medication to jail time to just about anything that you can think of. And then there's also about another $80 billion worth of indirect impact, things like lost wages, et cetera. Almost 75% of the people with a serious mental illness are unemployed. So when you talk about a significant portion of your population that is not actively contributing to today's economy or today's world, 75% of those where they're mentally ill, fall into that category, and it really has an economic impact. One of the other side ones is almost 90% of the people who commit suicide have a mental illness, and that has to do with them trying to cope with their mental illness, and unfortunately they take a permanent way out, if you will.
Yeah. With that economic impact, I would assume with families that really don't have an understanding of exactly what mental health or mental illness is and how it's affecting their loved ones can have some huge family impacts as well.
Oh, definitely. As a matter of fact, NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, talk about this a lot, and they have specific support groups for family members of individuals with mental illness. People that are mentally ill, because they don't understand a lot of times the nature of the illness, they tend to burn up those family relationships, if you will, because the families get frustrated, not knowing the true nature, I guess, of the mental illness.
You mentioned some of the numbers, and of course numbers are always in flux. And you look at some of the statistics that I've seen about mental illness, and they just don't seem to quite line up. And one of the things I've come to realize is that at any one given time, one individual might have multiple forms of a mental illness or diagnoses going on at the same time.
Correct.
Can you tell us about the impact of that and how that happens?
Well, I think it's a lot like, again, let's make the comparison to physical illnesses. If you had more than one physical illness going on, doctors may concentrate on whatever the primary one is, not knowing that there's other contributing, factors involved. So you're right. I mean, if a person is both bipolar, plus they're suffering from, one or more other, forms of mental illness, that's going to be hard. I mean, it's like treating people with multiple, conditions or multiple issues, definitely.
Yeah, the one that's coming to my mind is somebody who's maybe suffering from depression and they turn to some kind of chemical support like alcohol or other kind of drugs to help with those symptoms, and then now they've got the problem with the drug and the depression both, and it really complicates treatment.
Well, and I'll tell you what, that's a classic form of self-medication. They're having that mental illness, they maybe are hearing voices, or they're having hallucinations, and one of the ways that they think of as far as controlling those is by most often, doing like drugs or alcohol. And so, the numbers or the amount of drugs and alcohol that are consumed by people with mental illness is huge, because again, they're self-medicating, trying to control those voices without getting any help from somebody else.
Sure, that can be a real issue. When we come back, because we're going to take a break shortly, I want to talk to you about probably the most difficult situation, and that is the myth that the person with mental illness somehow is dangerous or somebody to be afraid of. I think that's an important topic that we need to look into.
Well, it definitely is, because it's all about public perception.
Okay, very good.
Okay.
Before, addiction and depression kept me from living my life. And now, every step I take in recovery benefits everyone. There are many options that make the road to recovery more accessible. It begins with the first step. Join the Voices for Recovery.
Welcome back. Jerry, before the break, I asked you about the myth that somehow people who suffer from mental illness are dangerous or are people to be feared. Could you talk to us a little bit about that, please?
And I think that part of that we're going to blame on the media, I think, because, whenever you see stories about mentally ill people, it's usually connected with some sort of, violence of some sort. The truth is that if you looked at the numbers as far as mental illness and some sort of, violent episode of some sort, the mentally ill are much more likely to be victims of violence than they are perpetrators of violence, certainly. So I think and that, again, it comes from a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of fear about mental illness because people don't understand it.
And that's really important. And of course, that's what this whole Layperson's Guide to Mental Illness is about, is to help people kind of overcome that. I think there is a lot of stigma about the disease of mental illness or the diseases of mental illness. And sometimes that stigma can really be more painful than the actual illness.
Oh,
Can
definitely.
you speak to that for us?
You know, stigma does so many things. Number one, it keeps 2/3 of the people who have a mental illness from actually seeking treatment, which is a crime. I mean, in reality, only 1/3 of the mentally ill actually go out and seek treatment because, you know, they feel like if they seek treatment, then they're going to be considered crazy or loco or something like that, and nobody wants to be viewed that way. The stigma also, you know, what we talked about before as far as how the family views their family member. You know, nobody wants to be stigmatized that way. And then I think the other piece is that if people don't have a good understanding of mental illness, a lot of things happen from the standpoint of not proper funding and not proper approach being taken to how to treat mental illness, really.
Understood. And that does kind of wrap around to something you said earlier that caught my attention, is that about 75% of the people, I think you said, that suffer from a mental illness are unemployed. In terms of accessing quality health care and stigma at the same time, boy, that's got to be a real burden for folks to carry. How do they get treatment?
Well, you know, and again, that's interesting. Now, there have been some changes in the law, fortunately, where a lot of treatment for mental illness is being treated the same as any other, you know, physical disorder. Federal law changed; they called it parity, and now insurance companies are being required to cover, you know, mental illness treatment and counseling, et cetera, almost as much as they do physical illnesses. If you went in with diabetes or cancer or something like that, so that, you know, that helps. And then the other piece is that a lot of mental health services are funded by the state. And if the state legislators or the decision makers don't understand the true nature of mental illness, you know, the fact that it is a biological disorder, how likely are they to, you know, allocate enough funds to really approach and address these needs seriously?
That's important, because a lot of times if somebody sees mental illness as being under the person's control or self-inflicted, like we see so often people feel about substance abuse, if it's a lifestyle or self-inflicted problem, why should I have to pay for it?
Exactly. And in reality, over half of the treatment that does happen is funded with taxpayer dollars, you know, kind of going back to the economic impact again. So a lot of that is being done with yours and mine dollars. It's not even necessarily insurance companies or anything like that, or paying out of their pocket. So it affects everybody, it really does.
And funding then is something that's difficult for the agencies, and that's kind of where the Inc. Board can come in and help agencies?
Exactly. The Inc. Board, because it is local funding, we can address local issues, and we've kind of used the mantra, local resources under local control to address local issues. And frankly, there are certain services for the mentally ill that the state does not fund. Many prevention programs aren't funded by the state, and we try to do some of that. Things like early identification, which I think is key when you're talking about mental illness, the same as you would any other disability. You know, so we try to do a lot of those as far as funding is concerned.
You mentioned early identification, and I think that is critical, and every doctor will always tell you that the earlier something is caught, the better the outcomes are going to be. With the kind of prevention or early intervention type programs, I think most people see mental illness as an adult issue. Does it also affect children? Oh,
it definitely does. We have a statistic from NAMI that 7% of school-age children have a serious emotional disorder, okay? And I have to chuckle just a little bit when I give that number, because when I have presented that number to teachers, they think it's hilariously low. I mean, they think it's much more than 7%, you know, just reflecting what they see in their classrooms, et cetera. Again, the comparison to any other physical disability is huge, because if I'm talking to a room full of women, and I always use the comparison of breast cancer, to be very honest with you, and I said, what's the number one way to have a best chances of surviving breast cancer? And the answer is always early detection. it is no different as far as mental illness is concerned. Early detection, so if we can detect it in school-age children or before the age of 18, we have a much better chance with treatment and medication to have that person lead a much more successful life than if we have to try to fix a 30-year-old after a situation has become critical. It's like any other physical thing. If you let it go critical,
Sure.
your chances of surviving are much less.
Sure. That kind of raises the issue as you share that. And we talked about myths and misconceptions and stigma, and you mentioned that something like 2/3 of the people in need of services don't access the help they need?
Correct. And again, it has to do with the misunderstanding. I mean, I think if most people or if their family members understood that this was a physical disorder, I mean, then you would go to your doctor. I mean, if your bones ached or if your head hurt or whatever, chances are you would go to a doctor to try and seek treatment, especially if you know that treatment is going to work.
Sure.
I mean, you know, that this isn't some sort of life sentence, if you will, you know, of mental illness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what you just said there is that treatment works is something that's really important, because again, if we look at the myths and misconceptions, the way maybe mental illness is portrayed in our media, I think a lot of people feel like there's no help, treatment doesn't work, it's not successful, and that our treatment agencies are just kind of revolving doors, if you will.
And I'll tell you what, nothing could be further from the truth. The numbers that we have for that 1/3 that do seek treatment, between 70 and 90% improve their quality of life through a combination of medication and counseling. And I'll reiterate that there's no magic bullet, there's no magic wand or anything like that. Mm-hmm. And it is a recovery process, very similar to substance abuse when we talk about that. But the right combinations of medication and counseling work tremendously. I mean, if you think about a 70 to 90% success rate, that'd be like Babe Ruth batting 800. I mean, his lifetime batting average was 342. Now, if he batted 800, I mean,
wow,
it'd be gangbusters, exactly. So these are terrific success rates, but we got to get them in the door.
Got to get them in the door. That's really critical. In terms of medication, you raised that whole issue of medication. Are the medications available for mental health issues working? Are they quality medications?
I'll tell you what, they've made a lot of strides in medications, even over the last 20 or 30 years. I mean, back in the 50s, et cetera, I mean, if you think of like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest or something like that, mm-hmm. There really was only 1 or 2 medications or treatments that were used for the mentally ill. Now they have a variety of them, but I'll be very honest with you, sometimes it's trial and error because you may react differently to a medication than I do, like we talked about earlier. So sometimes it takes the doctors, a couple of tries to figure out what right medication works for you.
Sure. That's really great information, Jerry, and I want to thank you very much for coming in today and being part of the show and sharing this information with our viewers. Again, could you share the number where people could contact you if they wanted to hear more or learn more?
Sure, and I'd like to give you a couple of resources.
Thank you.
Our number at the Inc. board is 630-892-5456. At the health department, again, ask for Alexis, and she's at 630-264-7670. Or if you're more internet inclined, go to kanecountymentalhealth.org. And we have a list of all the different mental health providers in the area, and then you can go to their links and find out what their direct services are.
Terrific. Thanks, Jerry.
Okay, well, thank you for having me, John.
For those with mental or substance use disorders, what does recovery look like? It's a transformation. It's a supporting hand. It's new beginnings. When does recovery start? It starts when you ask for help and support. Join the Voices for Recovery. Speak up. Reach out.